Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be diving into something we all do every day, learning from digital materials. Think about it. You know, online courses, how-to videos, news articles, social media, we're constantly bombarded with information, and most of that's coming at us through a screen these days. Now, a lot of the research on learning has focused, on the cognitive side of things, right? Like
Mm.
what's happening inside our heads, the mental gymnastics involved in learning something new.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for a long time, the dominant theories focused almost exclusively on those cognitive aspects, like cognitive load theory, right?
Yeah.
It tells us that our working memory is limited. We can only juggle so many pieces of information at once. It's kind of like if you have a small glass of water and you try to pour a whole pitcher into it, it just overflows. Same with our brains, too much information at once, and it just doesn't get processed effectively.
Makes sense.
And then you have the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which really emphasizes that we learn best when information is presented to us in both words and pictures, right? And not just passively presented, but when we actually have to actively make connections between those two.
Right. So both those theories, CLT and CTML, they gave us a really solid foundation for understanding how we process information,
Yeah.
how we select what we pay attention to, how we organize it in our minds, and how we integrate it with our existing knowledge.
Yeah.
And of course, those ideas have since evolved, right? Researchers started to realize, okay, it's not just about pure cognition. Our emotions play a role, like how we feel while learning can impact how much we retain.
Yeah.
And our awareness of our own learning process, what we call metacognition, that's also a big factor.
Absolutely.
So we have ACLT and ICOLM and KTLM, all these extensions and refinements to the original theories, really trying to capture the complexity of learning. But what I think is so interesting about the sources we're looking at today is this emphasis on something that's been, I think, somewhat overlooked for a long time, that learning, even in digital environments, isn't just a solo activity. There's a huge social component to it that can be incredibly influential.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. That's really the mission of our deep dive today, to explore how those social processes profoundly impact how we learn individually from digital materials. Our main source is this great review article called The Cognitive Effective Social Theory of Learning in Digital Environments.
Helpful.
Yeah, exactly, Castle. And it covers a wide range of digital learning tools, from simple text with images to interactive simulations and videos. But the focus here is really on that individual experience, one learner engaging with these resources.
Okay, so we've established that those earlier cognitive theories were really important. They provided a strong foundation. But there seems to have been a shift in thinking towards considering these social influences. What sparked that change?
Well, I think it comes down to this growing realization that even when we're seemingly alone, interacting with a computer or a tablet, our brains often react as if we're in a social situation. Those early cognitive theories were great for understanding how we take in information, but they were primarily looking at what was happening inside our heads, like a closed system almost. The later editions, incorporating emotions and self-awareness, were really important steps forward. But I think Castle and the research it reviews really argue that we can't fully grasp how we learn in digital spaces without taking into account these underlying social dynamics that are constantly being triggered.
So even though I might be physically alone in my room watching an online lecture, my brain is still picking up on social cues and responding in a social way.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do these social processes sort of sneak into our solo digital learning experiences? What are some of the core theoretical ideas that help us understand this?
Well, two really key concepts here are the computers as social actors paradigm, which we call KAISA for short, and the media equation theory. And basically what these theories propose is that we tend to treat computers and digital media as if they were social beings, even though logically we know they're not. Like, have you ever found yourself saying thank you to your GPS after it gives you directions?
Oh, absolutely. All the time.
Or maybe even getting frustrated and kind of snapping at it when it leads you astray.
Yeah.
I think we all do that to some extent. And that's the media equation in action, right? We're applying those same social rules and expectations to technology, even though it's not human.
It's like my brain forgets it's just a machine and starts interacting with it like it's another person. So what is it about digital media that triggers that social response? What are the cues that sort of flip that switch in our brains?
I think it comes down to specific social cues that are embedded in the media itself. Things like a voice, even if it's computer generated, or visual elements that mimic human behavior, like a character looking directly at you or using hand gestures. These are the things that really tap into our built-in social radar, those mental shortcuts we use to understand and navigate social situations. Our
Mhm.
brains are just wired to respond to these cues in a social way almost automatically.
So it's like we have this set of social triggers, and sometimes digital media can push those buttons without us even realizing it. Okay, so one term that came up a lot in the research was social presence. What exactly does that mean in the context of digital learning?
Right. So social presence refers to the feeling that you get that another person is involved in the interaction, even if they're not physically present. It's that sense of being with someone, of shared experience. And this feeling is influenced by how immediate and how personal the communication feels. So, for example, a live video call where you're getting real-time feedback and you can see facial expressions and body language, that creates a much stronger sense of social presence than, say, reading an email.
Right, because email feels very asynchronous, right?
Exactly.
You send it off,
Yeah,
and you might not get a response for hours or even days. There's not that sense of immediacy.
right. And higher social presence, generally speaking, can make the learning experience more engaging and more relevant.
Okay, so high social presence makes it feel more like a back and forth conversation. Now, what about parasocial interaction? That's often shortened to PSI. That sounds a bit more one-sided.
Yeah, it is. PSI refers to those relationships we form with media personalities, characters in a show, avatars in a game, even just the voice of a narrator in an audiobook. It's not a real reciprocal relationship, obviously, but we still develop cognitive, emotional, and even behavioral connections with those
It's
personas.
like when you feel like you really know a YouTuber or a podcaster, even though they have no idea who you are.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a perfect example. And research has shown that these parasocial relationships can have a real impact on how we learn.
Okay, so how does this one-sided relationship actually impact learning?
Well, on a cognitive level, we pay closer attention to those personas that we have a parasocial bond with. We tend to evaluate what they're saying more carefully. We connect it more readily to our existing knowledge. On an emotional level, we might feel empathy or sympathy for them. And then behaviorally, we might be more likely to follow their suggestions or to be persuaded by their arguments. So, what Castle highlights is that this strong PSI, this parasocial interaction, can actually lead to greater engagement with the learning material. It can make it more enjoyable, increase how much we identify with the content, and even make the information presented more convincing.
So if I feel a connection with the instructor in an online course, I'm actually more likely to learn effectively from them.
Right, exactly.
That's fascinating. Okay, and then the last one of these sort of foundational social theories that we need to touch on is the theory of social comparison processes. So how does that fit into our understanding of digital learning?
So, this theory suggests that as humans, we have this inherent drive to evaluate our own abilities and opinions. We want to know how we stack up.
Yeah.
And when there's no clear, objective way to measure ourselves, we tend to look to others for comparison. And in digital learning environments, this can manifest in things like leaderboards, right? You
Okay.
see how you're performing relative to other learners, or you see how many people have completed a certain module or achieved a certain badge or whatever it might be. Even if those are just anonymous scores, it still gives us a point of reference.
Right. It's like my brain can't help but compare. So if
Hmm.
I see that I'm at the bottom of the leaderboard, that might motivate me to try harder,
Mhm.
right? Or if I see that I'm way ahead of everyone else, I might get complacent. So how does this social comparison actually affect the learning process itself?
Yeah, well, I think you just hit on the two main ways it can impact us, right? It can be incredibly motivating, pushing us to put in more effort if we feel like we're falling behind. But it can also influence our behavior.
Hmm.
We might change our study strategies, the way we approach the material, based on how we perceive ourselves relative to others. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that the impact of social comparison is not always straightforward. It can depend on things like how similar we perceive ourselves to be to those we're comparing ourselves to. Like, if I see that someone who I think is really similar to me is doing much better in the course, that might motivate me more than if it's someone who I think is, way more advanced or has a totally different learning style.
So it's not just the raw comparison, it's how I interpret that comparison, how relevant it feels to me personally.
Exactly. Yeah. And how relevant that comparison feels to our goals. Like, if my goal is just to pass the course, I might not be as bothered by being at the bottom of the leaderboard as someone whose goal is to be top of the class. So it's complex.
Right. It's very nuanced. Okay, so we've now looked at some of these foundational theories. We've talked about CASA, the media equation, social presence, PSI, and social comparison. Now let's get to the heart of our source material and really delve into the main theory that's presented, which is CASTLE, the cognitive affective social theory of learning in digital environments.
Yeah.
So what exactly is CASTLE, and what does it tell us about how social factors shape digital learning?
So, CASTLE is essentially a framework that tries to integrate those social processes that we've been talking about into our broader understanding of how we learn with digital materials. And it builds upon those earlier cognitive theories like CTML, but it adds this really crucial social layer. And the central idea here is what they call the social mediation hypothesis.
Okay. Social mediation hypothesis. Break that down for me. What does that actually mean?
So, in essence, it means that those social processes that get triggered by the social cues in digital learning materials, they don't just make us feel a certain way, but they actually directly influence, they mediate how we process information on a cognitive level. It's not just that a friendly avatar makes us feel good, but that friendliness actually changes how our brains take in and make sense of the information.
Okay, so it's saying that like a conversational tone in an instructional video doesn't just make me like the video more, it actually changes how my brain processes the information being presented.
Exactly. Yeah, you got it. And Castle kind of breaks this down into several key sub-hypotheses. So first, you have the activation hypothesis, which we already touched on a bit. This basically states that those social cues in the digital environment activate our social schemas, those mental frameworks we use to understand social situations.
Right, because we talked about how our brains were kind of primed to
Yeah.
look for and respond to those cues.
Right. And then the second one is the cognitive influence hypothesis, which really spells out that those parasocial processes directly impact those core cognitive processes of learning. Things like selecting information, organizing it in our minds, integrating it with what we already know, and then being able to retrieve it later.
Got it. So social cues wake up our social understanding, and then that in turn affects how our brains handle the actual learning material. Okay, so what are the other sub-hypotheses?
So the third one is the interaction hypothesis. And this one highlights that social processes don't happen in a vacuum, right? They're interacting with and being influenced by our motivation to learn, our emotional state while we're learning, and our metacognitive processes. That's basically our awareness of and control over our own learning process.
So for example, if I feel a sense of connection with the person teaching an online course, that might actually boost my motivation to really pay attention to what they're saying and engage with the material more deeply.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great example. And then the fourth one is the schema influence hypothesis, which basically proposes that how strongly and how quickly those social schemas are activated depends on two main things: the strength and number of social cues that are present in the material, and how developed those schemas are in the learner's mind based on their past experiences. So the more cues there are, the stronger those cues are, and the more experience a learner has with similar social situations, the faster those social responses are going to kick in.
Makes sense. So if the digital learning environment is just flooded with social cues, those are going to have a much bigger impact on my learning experience than if there are just a few subtle cues. And if I've encountered similar cues before in real life, then my brain is going to recognize them more readily and respond to them more quickly.
Okay.
And then the last one.
Yeah, the last one is the social cue strength hypothesis. And this one focuses more on the learning material itself. And it proposes that the modality of the material, whether it's text or images or video, whether it's static or dynamic, and how interactive it is, all of those factors influence how strongly the social cues in that material can actually activate our social schemas.
So generally speaking, dynamic and interactive media are going to be more effective at conveying those social cues than just static text on a screen.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so Castle provides this, really comprehensive framework for thinking about how social elements that are built into digital learning materials can really shape how we learn. But I noticed in the outline we also had this idea of combining cognitive and social processes. So how do these different perspectives kind of work together to give us a more complete understanding of digital learning?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to remember that Castle isn't operating in isolation, right? It connects with and builds upon other theories that also kind of bridge that gap between the cognitive and the social. So, for example, you have social constructivist theory, which emphasizes that knowledge is constructed through social interactions. So even if I'm learning by myself, the way that information is presented and structured might reflect certain social norms or ways of thinking that I've internalized.
Right, so the information itself, even if it's just facts and figures, might be framed in a way that assumes a certain social context or a shared understanding.
Exactly, yeah. And then you have social cognitive theory, which highlights that a lot of learning happens through observing and modeling others. So even in a digital environment, if I'm not directly interacting with other learners, I might be watching a virtual tutor solve a problem or observing simulations of social interactions. And both of those can influence my own learning.
So the digital tool itself can almost act like a social influence on us.
Right, exactly. And this leads into this idea of socially situated cognition, which argues that learning isn't just this internal mental process, but it's really embedded in our actions, our interactions with others, and the resources that are available in our environment, including those digital resources.
So that digital learning environment becomes part of that social context, even if it's not a real-world physical space.
Exactly, yeah. It kind of becomes a partner in the learning process.
Okay. And then in the outline, we also had these terms social facilitation and social inhibition. So how do those concepts fit in here?
Right. So these terms really relate back to the idea of social presence that we talked about earlier. Social facilitation refers to the phenomenon where our performance on a task actually improves just because we feel like other people are present. And this can happen even when those other people are just digital representations.
So even if it's just an avatar or a virtual character, my brain still registers that presence and it can actually make me perform better.
Yeah, exactly. And it's often explained by the idea that the perceived presence of others increases our arousal levels. Like we get a little bit more amped up, or it makes us more self-aware, so we're more conscious of how we're performing. Now, the flip side of that is social inhibition, which is where our performance actually suffers when we feel like we're being observed or evaluated.
Oh, interesting.
And the complexity of the task seems to play a big role here. So for really difficult or challenging tasks, feeling like we're being watched can sometimes make us more anxious and actually hinder our performance.
So if a digital learning environment makes me feel like I'm constantly being observed, that could either help or hurt my learning, depending on what I'm trying to learn.
Exactly, yeah, it's really task dependent. Okay, so I think to really understand how their social influences work, we need to talk about social representations and social schemas.
Okay.
So social representations are essentially the shared knowledge, beliefs, and values that a group of people hold. And these get internalized by individuals and kind of transformed into social schemas.
So social schemas are like those mental blueprints we use to make sense of different social situations. Like if I go to a restaurant, I have a schema for how I'm supposed to behave, what to expect from the waiter, how to order, all of that.
Exactly, you got it. And in the context of digital learning, even environments that don't seem explicitly social can still activate those schemas.
Because even the design of a website or the language used can convey certain social norms or expectations.
Right. And then there are more specific types of social schemas, like self-schemas, which is how we view ourselves, and collaboration scripts, which are our expectations for how teamwork should unfold. And all of these can influence how we understand information and behave, even when we're just interacting with a digital learning tool.
Okay, so all of our pre-existing social understanding, even stuff that's operating below our conscious awareness, can shape how we experience digital learning.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics now of how social cues actually manifest in different types of digital learning materials. Let's start with static verbal materials, just text on a screen. What are some of the social cues that we might encounter there?
Well, one really important social cue is personalized language,
Okay,
which leads to what we call the personalization effect.
so instead of saying learners should consider the following steps, it's more effective to say you should consider these steps.
Exactly.
Why is that little tweak so impactful?
Well, the idea is that that direct address, that use of you and your, activates those self-schemas that we talked about. So it makes the content feel more relevant to the learner, more interesting, easier to kind of connect with on a personal level.
So it's like the material is speaking directly to me. It's not just some abstract concept out there.
Exactly.
Now, is that always effective? Or are there times when that kind of personalization might not be as beneficial?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. How effective personalization is can depend on things like the learner's prior knowledge. So learners with less prior knowledge about a topic tend to benefit more from personalization, the type of content being learned, and even cultural differences in how people perceive direct address. So what might feel engaging and friendly in one culture might feel a little too forward or even intrusive in another culture.
Right, so you have to be sensitive to those cultural nuances.
Absolutely.
Okay, and then you also mentioned cultural cues in the outline. So how do those act as social cues in static verbal materials?
So cultural cues are basically design choices that are informed by specific cultural norms and values. And a great example of this is something called the politeness effect. Studies have shown that when instructions and feedback are phrased politely, rather than in a very direct or blunt way, learners tend to perform better. And this really aligns with politeness theory from social psychology, which
Hmm.
basically says that we all have this desire to maintain a sense of respect and face in social interactions, even when those interactions are with digital systems.
Right, because even though it's just a computer program, I still don't want to feel like I'm being talked down to or insulted.
Exactly. And so by being polite in those digital learning environments, it can make the learner feel more comfortable, more engaged, more willing to take risks and experiment. Now, it's worth noting that this effect tends to be stronger in cultures that place a high value on indirect communication and politeness. So again, that cultural context is really important.
It's like you said before, what works well in one culture might not translate as effectively to another culture. Now, what about using dialects or even slang in text? Is there any research on whether that can be an effective social cue?
Yeah, there's actually some interesting research on that. So, studies suggest that when the learning material uses the learner's native dialect or a sociolect that they identify with, that can act as a really powerful social cue, making the material more interesting and even improving comprehension and retention.
It's like you're speaking my language, literally and figuratively.
Right. And I think that's because it creates a stronger sense of connection and identification. It feels more familiar, more relatable.
Right, like it's coming from someone I trust or someone who understands me.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to static visual learning materials. So things like pictures, diagrams, infographics. What kind of social cues do we find in those?
Well, one key aspect that we see in static visual materials is what's called emotional design. And this is the idea that the emotions that visual elements evoke can actually be interpreted as social information.
Right.
So, for example, if a learning environment uses warm, inviting colors, positive imagery, things that make us feel good, that might signal a supportive and encouraging atmosphere.
Right, it creates a certain tone or a vibe.
Well, exactly. And research has shown that those positive emotions can increase learner satisfaction and can actually lead to enhanced learning outcomes. However, one thing to note is that we still need more research to really fully understand the interplay between emotions triggered by visuals and other social influences in learning. So it's an area that's ripe for further investigation. But the main takeaway here is that the visual style of digital learning environments is not just about aesthetics, it can communicate social and emotional cues that can impact the learner's experience.
So even those subtle design choices can have a big impact. Okay, now what about when those visuals actually depict people? So not just abstract shapes or diagrams, but actual human figures or human-like characters. How do those act as social cues?
Yeah, so that brings us to human representations and anthropomorphism. And anthropomorphism is basically our tendency to attribute human-like qualities, things like intentions, emotions, thoughts, to non-human entities.
Like talking animals in cartoons.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
giving a name and a personality to my car.
Precisely. And when we encounter human-like forms in learning materials, it automatically triggers our social processing mechanisms. And this can have a number of effects. It can increase how much we care about the learning material, how much we trust the information being presented. It can enhance that sense of social interaction, even if it's just with a digital representation. And on a motivational level, anthropomorphism can actually increase our intrinsic motivation to learn. So we're more interested in the material for its own sake, and that can lead to more engaged processing and better learning outcomes.
So giving a character in a learning game a face and a name can make me more likely to pay attention to what they're saying and actually learn from them.
Right. And even just showing eyes, like we talked about before, that direct gaze can be a really powerful cue that triggers those social responses. And this is where pedagogical agents come into play, which we'll discuss a bit more when we get to dynamic materials.
Yeah.
But even in static visuals, the way humans are designed and presented can act as really important social cues.
Okay, so let's shift gears now and talk about dynamic learning materials. So things like videos, animations, simulations. How do those social cues play out in those more dynamic environments?
Right. So research has consistently shown that when instructional videos create a stronger sense of parasocial interaction, learners tend to achieve higher learning outcomes. And we can understand this in terms of both how we process the information and how we respond to it emotionally. So on that cognitive level, you have social cues like the presenter's gestures, right? Those gestures can direct our attention to important points. They can help us to understand complex ideas more easily. Even something as subtle as the presenter making eye contact with the camera can increase our sense of connection and improve learning. And then on an emotional level, forming that bond with the presenter, even if it's just that one-sided parasocial relationship, can really boost our engagement and motivation to learn.
So it's not just what's being said in the video, but how it's being presented, the nonverbal cues that the presenter is giving off that can really impact my learning.
Exactly. Yeah, all of those subtle social cues play a role.
And that's something that I think a lot of people who create instructional videos maybe don't always think about, but it's really important.
Absolutely. And that leads into something we call the voice principle, which applies specifically to auditory messages. And this principle suggests that the spoken content in digital learning materials should be delivered in a natural conversational tone. And things like highly distorted voices or strong, unfamiliar accents should be avoided. And this really ties back to that personalization principle that we talked about earlier. It's about making the speaker feel more relatable, more human, more trustworthy.
Right, because if the voice sounds too robotic or artificial, it's harder to connect with it on a social level.
Exactly. And the way someone speaks, their rhythm, their intonation, their emphasis, all of those things can convey enthusiasm. They can even shape how we perceive their personality and their credibility. And while research has shown that perceived trustworthiness of the speaker doesn't always directly translate to better learning outcomes, things like the speaker's enthusiasm and a clear, pleasant voice quality, those have been shown to improve learner engagement and satisfaction. So there's definitely something to be said for having a good voice.
Right, like a monotone voice is just going to lull me to sleep, whereas a more dynamic and engaging voice will keep me interested.
Exactly.
Now, what about actual physical movements in dynamic media?
Right.
We talked about gestures in the context of videos, but are there other types of movements that can act as social cues?
Yeah, absolutely. So movements are incredibly powerful triggers for social cues. And we talked about gestures, especially those that point to or illustrate important information. Those can be really effective for enhancing learning.
Right, because it's like they're guiding my attention to the key points.
Exactly. And even subtle eye movements, like if you have a virtual instructor and their eyes move to focus on a particular part of the screen, that can actually be beneficial for learners. And then the act of the instructor drawing or creating visualizations live, that can also be really helpful. It fosters that sense of being actively guided through the material.
So it's more engaging than just looking at a static image.
Right, exactly. And beyond specific gestures, our overall body language, what we call kinesics, things like head movements, facial expressions, posture, all of those things can influence how we perceive the presenter in terms of their approachability, their believability, their trustworthiness.
So all of those dynamic cues, the gestures, the eye contact, the voice, they all kind of work together to create a stronger sense of social presence and parasocial interaction, which ultimately leads to better learning.
Exactly. Yeah, they all contribute to that overall social experience.
Now, you mentioned pedagogical agents earlier, and I know those can be used in both static and dynamic learning materials.
Yeah.
So how do they fit into this landscape of social cues?
Right. So pedagogical agents are essentially computer-generated characters that are designed to fulfill some kind of instructional role.
Okay.
They can demonstrate tasks, they can provide feedback and guidance, they can be sources of information, they can even administer assessments. And research has shown that on average, they can have a small but significant positive effect on learning.
So they can be a useful tool.
Yeah, definitely. But the key is that creating effective pedagogical agents is a complex process. And there's a lot of ongoing research trying to understand which design elements make them most effective. Things like their visual appearance. Should they be more realistic or more cartoonish? What kind of voice should they have? Should they be very expressive with their movements and gestures or more subdued? How should learners be able to interact with them? All of those are really important considerations.
So it's not just about slapping a cartoon character on the screen and calling it a pedagogical agent.
Yeah.
There's a lot of thought and research that goes into designing them effectively. Now, what happens when we move into interactive learning materials? So things like games, simulations, virtual environments, where the learner can actually interact with the digital world. How do social cues work in those contexts?
Yeah, so interactive media open up a whole new range of possibilities for incorporating social cues. And one area where we see this really clearly is in how social comparison gets triggered. So interactive elements like leaderboards, progress bars, simulations where you're competing against virtual opponents, all of those things can activate those social comparison processes that we talked about earlier and can really influence the learner's motivation and behavior.
Right, because now it's not just comparing myself to some abstract average. I'm actually seeing how I stack up against other learners in real time.
Exactly. And for some learners, that can be really motivating, right? It pushes them to try harder to improve their performance.
Yeah.
But for other learners, it can actually be anxiety provoking or lead them to focus more on just winning or getting ahead rather than on actually understanding the material.
Right, because the goal becomes to beat the other players rather than to master the content.
Exactly. So designers of interactive learning materials really have to be mindful of that and think carefully about how they incorporate those competitive elements.
Okay, what about social cues in the feedback that we receive in interactive environments? Because now the feedback is not just coming from, a static piece of text. It's often coming from the system itself or from a virtual character.
Right. So feedback is a really powerful social cue, especially in interactive environments.
Um,
And when that feedback is detailed and personalized, it can actually make the system or the virtual agent seem more human-like, more credible. And that can activate those social schemas that we talked about earlier and lead to greater learner engagement. However, feedback can also be a double-edged sword. If it's not designed carefully, it can be distracting, or it can even feel overly critical or discouraging.
right, like if the feedback is too harsh or too vague, it might make me feel like I'm not good at this. And that could actually discourage me from continuing.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot of research being done on how to design feedback effectively to maximize its benefits and minimize those potential negative effects.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned more complex social cues in the outline. So what are some examples of those in interactive environments?
Yeah, so beyond those simple comparisons and feedback mechanisms, interactive media can present learners with more complex social situations. So things like discrepancies in information, different viewpoints, or even scenarios where they have to collaborate or negotiate with virtual characters or agents. And these more nuanced social cues can actually drive deeper learning by challenging our existing understanding and sparking what we call epistemic curiosity.
Epistemic curiosity. That sounds interesting. What is that exactly?
So, epistemic curiosity is basically a desire to learn more in order to resolve a conflict or an inconsistency in our knowledge.
Okay, so if I encountered two conflicting pieces of information, that might make me want to dig deeper and figure out which one is correct or how they can both be true.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's a theory called conflict elaboration theory that suggests that when we encounter these different perspectives or conflicting viewpoints, even in a seemingly solo digital environment, it can lead to more critical thinking and better retention of the information.
So being presented with multiple answers or perspectives within an interactive module can actually make me think more deeply about the material and understand it at a deeper level.
Right. Because it forces you to kind of reconcile those different viewpoints and figure out what you believe.
That's fascinating. Okay, so are there any other types of complex social cues that we should be aware of?
Yeah. So we also have what are called group awareness processes. And this refers to a learner's awareness of the social environment, even if it's a digital environment. So social cues in the interface can give us information about other learners, things like their progress, their opinions, what they're working on. And this awareness can influence our own perspective and how we evaluate our own performance.
Right, because even if I'm not directly interacting with those other learners, just knowing that they're there and seeing what they're doing can still impact my own learning experience.
Absolutely. And then finally, we have social identity theory, which suggests that learners tend to categorize new information and even digital entities into social groups based on their values and their emotional significance. So if I feel a sense of similarity or connection to the learning material or to the characters within that material, that can activate those social schemas and make me more motivated to learn.
It's like we're constantly trying to figure out where we fit in, even in the digital world. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about all sorts of ways that social processes can influence digital learning. But the review article also points out some limitations of the castle.